going to talk about Major Dundee, the Sam Peckinpah film, which can be seen here in this Arrow release, which is very much out of print. Which is this when you get a booklet, the different cuts and documentaries, and it's all rather gorgeous. And I can show you now, you get a poster too. It's all lovely. But again, it's my typical thing of watching a film years after its physical media release. Of course, we use Richard Harris. And here's the wonderful book, which you cost you a fortune to buy because it's all out of print now. And you can just, I'm not sure you can even get the basic version of this now on Arrow, but I tend to buy stuff and then eventually watch it because I don't watch things straight away. I much prefer to watch them when I feel like watching them. Plus, I'd already seen Major Dundee, so it wasn't like I was in, like, oh no, I have to see this film. I had seen it, but Major Dundee is one of those Sam Peckinpah films that I viewed as one of his flawed films, as one of his broken films. And in this, in the box set, you get the theatrical cut, which was re-edited by the producer and Charlton Heston, apparently. And it wasn't a different music, and it wasn't what Peckinpah wanted. And it was viewed as a film that was cut down far beyond what Peckinpah wanted. So the film I'm talking about is the extended cut, which they put back together later, which they got a new score that was much more than what Peckinpah wanted. They put some scenes back in. So that's the first I'm going to be talking about. I've seen the original one years and years ago, so it's been a long time. But I do know, thinking about the score seemed a bit off, and it did seem a bit choppy. Before this video, I didn't bother rewatching it. I was fine watching the version that was closer to what Peckinpah wanted. Now, this is a flawed film. This is a very flawed film. I don't think this film is ever going to be right, is the big takeaway I get from just watching the film and seeing what was shot and what they had available to them. And I don't think it's one person's fault. I think it's a case of they had lots of people with talent, all of which whom had different views on what they wanted to do with this film. That's what I get from it, the sense of everybody had their view of how to make this film work, but everyone had different views on what the film should be. So you got Peckinpah shooting one film, the producer wanted another film, which was more studio bound and more normal. Heston actually liking Peckinpah and supporting him, and he actually supported him, giving up some of his salary to keep Peckinpah in the film. But Heston wanted to keep it within, because it was a big budget film, he wanted to keep it within reason to what people would expect to see in the cinema. But he wanted to give Peckinpah a space to do it. And you basically got this weird mix, this clash of these different sensibilities. Because once the studio was wanting a romantic vision of a manhunt, a kind of film you've seen in a lot of stuff in the 60s, like John Wayne films and things, where they're chasing after bandits, or chasing after somebody, and it's the kind of stern patrician figure that is going to put things right for the country, while the country itself is going through the Vietnam War and it's tearing itself apart. So this was like just to suit the older generation of America. This was the Charlton Heston was a movie star for the 50s generation who came out after the war, who saw him as a kind of successor to people like John Wayne, really strong figures who could pose well. Apparently that was the big thing that drove Peckinpah nuts, but Heston, he was very good at posing and doing the kind of manly poses for the camera that Peckinpah thought were stupid. So you had that version versus the Peckinpah version, which was much more managed, compromised. There is no such thing as a pure, like, good. It's good. Good and evil is basically an eye of the beholder. Like, evil people have their own reasons for doing things. Good people have their flaws. And everything's just very messed up. It's something you'd see a lot more as the films progressed into the Wild Bunch and into Straw Dogs and Pat Garrett and Billy Kid. Everyone has their reasons in Peckinpah films. And Peckinpah's a romantic of a different type of self-destruction and self-delusion. And so you have these two kind of sensibilities clashing. Now, people, because of Ride the High Country, where Peckinpah had full control and made a really good film, people were into the idea that Peckinpah could be a kind of bridge between the older generation and the younger generation, because he had done TV that had been successful. He'd created a TV show with Brian Keith that was very successful. He'd done Ride the High Country. He was viewed as a safe pair of hands for going from one generation to the other, in a sense of he had a great sensibility. Maybe not in personality, but at least the sensibility. But the studio and Peckinpah did not see eye to eye in this film, because Peckinpah was going much more extreme to what he thought the film should be. The studio wanted something much more conservative. And that was never going to work. Basically, they never talked to each other honestly beforehand on what the expectations were. And I think the feeling was people just moved it, because essentially Charlton Heston started the project, and he'd a schedule where he had to be off the film by a certain point to go and do another film. So they had a script that no one liked, and Peckinpah was brought in to direct it and to rewrite it all, but it had to be done a certain time to get this thing done. And he never really gave him enough time, and no one really talked about what was actually expected. It was much more about they assumed that Peckinpah knew what they wanted, and Peckinpah wanted to do his own thing. So you had two divergent things. They wanted an adventure film, and Peckinpah wanted a tragedy of a man who was obsessed by something that wasn't going to give him any satisfaction at the end of it. Essentially, he had to hunt this Indian down who'd killed all these white settlers. And it was like, well, you're stealing the land from the Indians. They were just retaliating. So I think Peckinpah wanted all of this complexity, like a man going to adjust what he was a just war, going into Mexico to hunt someone down, and it turns out it's not a just war, and he ends up getting into trouble with the French who are in Mexico at the same time, and getting hunted down by them, and still hunting this other guy down. The sense of this was a man on a mission that was kind of insane. And Peckinpah had elements like this was going on during the Civil War, and Major Dundee had been sent to the basically had been viewed as too extreme by his own people and been sent to the frontier to avoid him in the war. And that's where where Richard Harris was. Well, Richard Harris was someone who he once knew and thought of as a friend, and he viewed Harris as a betrayer because he was fighting for the South, and they have a lot of issues. So you have all this mix of different characters, and Peckinpah wanted to go into it in depth. Like, these are self-destructive characters who have got idealism and who are blind to their own faults. That did not work well with Heston's image. Nor did it work well with Heston's ability as an actor. Now, Charlton Heston is one of those actors who's done a lot of good films and a lot of bad films. He has championed strange directors like Peckinpah, like Orson Welles, when Orson Welles was persona non grata with Touch of Evil, because he supported him Touch of Evil, but to only to a certain point. And he'd done stuff with Anthony Mann's film El Cid just recently before this film, which was, I think, Heston's best film. It was a great film. And he'd done some adventurous films. He had been into civil rights, but he's still a conservative actor who did work with Cecil B. DeMille. He had come off Ben-Hur, which was a massive success. He had come off Ten Commandments, which was a massive success. So he was viewed as a guy who could carry these epics. El Cid was a massive success. So he was the safe pair of hands to lead the film. They wanted him to be the lead, and this was a period where Charlton Heston was a name, which would lead up to the late 60s, and even the early 70s. He was still getting lead parts in sci-fi movies like Soylent Green, things like that. But eventually, it's during the 70s he became old-fashioned. But in the 60s, you still see someone who could be in middle ground. The studios liked him, and directors liked working with him as well. And even though they might disagree in certain things, they both usually went into trying to make a good film. But in this film, he was asked to play someone who was stubborn and couldn't view themselves critically. And Heston had a problem with that. Heston was okay with your plan to play a cynical person like in Planet of the Apes or the 70s sci-fi movies, where he's playing pure cynicism. He can do that really well. He can do the heroic thing. But the thing of being the hero who's actually doesn't realise he's a fool, that went against Heston's image. Heston was a wistful figure. Heston was like the romance of humanity and romance of the great quest. And he couldn't really into the absurdity of it. Really. Unless he probably with proper directors could have put him into it. But Peckinpah wasn't that director. Peckinpah could not get Heston to the level of performance this film needed. This film needed someone who was, stubborn, but also was willing to show the stupidity of the character. Heston could grudgingly show him as flawed, but not as actually stupid. You needed a Kirk Douglas, basically. Kirk Douglas could play the stupidity of a character and not make you hate him. He could play the guy as he thinks he knows what he's doing, but maybe he doesn't. So basically, the wrong leading actor. It's a Kirk Douglas movie starring Charlton Heston. It's kind of a problem. The other big problem beyond the studio is the fact that Richard Harris is much more interesting than Charlton Heston in this film. Charlton Heston has most of the scenes. Charlton Heston has the arc. But Richard Harris is more interesting. Richard Harris plays a guy who is... He came in from Ireland, from Irish descent. He's a man who's been various things in his life, and now he's fighting for the South. And that's just fascinating. Harris actually plays up this guy who has seen it all, is fairly cynical, but amused by humanity. And it's a much more interesting performance. And it's even though I think him and Peckinpah didn't always get on, and they end up, he thought his part was underwritten and wasn't given enough, and that's went short scenes later on to beef the part up. The problem with that is, yeah, he's right. Basically, this is the better character. And essentially, Heston was the lead character, and Peckinpah had directed the lead character. But the other character he'd written to offset the lead character, the sidekick who they had a very kind of tense relationship, was the more interesting human character. And Harris has a lot of fun with the part when he's on camera. Apparently, not the most fun for him off camera, because he was just had his first big hit, and he was trying to figure out how to be a movie star. So that wasn't much fun for people dealing with him. But Harris was always an actor who was had a sense of ego to him, which was good and bad. Like the ego, maybe somebody who's working with him might not have been great, but infused a lot of his parts with some charm, and when you got him in the right part, he could really deliver. And he did a lot of trash too, but given the right part, he could really deliver though. That was the big thing with him. And he has the right part here, he just doesn't have enough scenes. And basically, it should have been a two-hander, a true two-hander. Instead, it's a two-hander at times when that's the film's at its best. And then when Harris is not featured as much, when it's more just in Heston dealing with this love interest, which is nicely acted, but it's not that interesting. There's a woman who's helping the poor in Mexico during the various civil wars going on there. And it's nicely done, but for the acting, but the writing's kind of basic there, and it's there to prove that Dundee is a more flawed person than he really would like to think he is, but it's not developed brilliantly. And there's a big problem with the script, as the script feels like it needed another 3 months of work before they got to shooting, just to kind of iron out a lot of stuff, because you get parts of this film where it's going really well, and there's interesting things, and Heston's actually been specific and been interesting in the early parts. And whenever he's with Richard Harris, it works too. But these other scenes, it feels like it's underdeveloped because they haven't had time to finish the damn thing. And they're still trying to rewrite and reshoot it. And so the funny thing is, Heston was actually became fairly popular with people because he actually stood up for Peckinpah. I know he thought he would, but he did. But it wasn't a Peckinpah leading actor was a problem. Again, Steve McQueen would have been more interested, but he wasn't a big star at that point. But there's lots of actors who could have done it better. But it's just a case of Peckinpah couldn't really write for Charlton Heston the way play wished he could, and he couldn't get Heston to deliver the performance that he was trying to do. This man who avoids blind spots, not realising the absurdity of his existence, of his mission, and Heston couldn't deliver. Not in the script that was delivered to him. There was either needed more cynicism on the surface there, or needed something else, but there was no motors there to get Heston to deliver the performance that was needed to make this thing work. And there's a criticism of Peckinpah was like he was trying to make this Moby Dick film basically, when the studio just wanted to do a programmer, and it was like he was making this something an epic that didn't need to be an epic, but he was actually trying to say that this whole thing was stupid and it was absurd when they were trying to do a heroic thing, and it was just like two things clashing all the time, two like points of view clashing that wouldn't work till later on in the 60s when Peckinpah was given his free reign with Wild Bunch, when it was more cynical time, where his cynicism could actually be given full force to explode all over the screen. Sorry for that metaphor, but that's what Peckinpah did. He exploded all over the screen with lots of blood. So yeah, it's a frustrating film, but it's also an interesting one. It's just like it's got Peckinpah like toned down to deal with the politeness of the studio, which in some ways is good because Peckinpah could be self-indulgent, but it also means you're missing all the kind of poetic stuff and all the kind of savagery about the stupidity of man that you can get with 70s Peckinpah, which some people don't like, but I do. So there's, because Peckinpah, as he was self-destructing, did a lot of interesting stuff. Not the easiest person to deal with day to day. A lot of people get alienated by him, but he was doing interesting things like the bringing the head of Alfredo Garcia, which Roger Kirby's just done a video on, which is different view from mine. He doesn't like it, but I'd recommend you go and see that video as well. And doing things like Cross of Iron and Pat Garrett and Billy Kid, I found were all fascinating, complicated films. So this is an early flawed Peckinpah, but I would definitely recommend you watching it. But watch the longer version. It is too long, but there's a lot of interesting things going on there. And you can see Peckinpah setting himself up for what was going to come. But there we go. Hope you enjoyed this video. That's me for now. Right, bye.